Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What was your creepy, unexplainable story as a child that was confirmed by your parents to have happened? Story 1. Oppressive Evil.
I was looking for a Halloween costume with my mom to wear to elementary school, which was a significant event for me because I had been homeschooled initially. We spent a couple of hours visiting several stores but could not find anything that I liked. It was getting dark outside and we were running out of time, so we had to find something and head home soon. As a last resort, we decided to check out an old Halloween costume store. One of those peculiar places that somehow stays open throughout the year. We got out of the car, walked through the front doors, and took just 3 steps into the store, when I suddenly felt all the hair on my body stand on end. I was overcome with an oppressive sensation, as if I was physically being hated by something. It felt like this presence not only disliked me, but also wanted to harm me and force me to leave immediately. At that moment, my younger self, 3rd grade, I believe, turned to look at my mom. At the exact same time, she turned to look at me. Neither of us said a word. We simply turned around and walked straight out of the store. We went back to the car, and as we sat inside, I asked my mom if she had felt the same thing I had. She told me she had experienced essentially the same oppressive feeling. Right then, we prayed together in the car and left the area. For context, I was an elementary school student who desperately wanted to fit in with my new classmates in public school. I willingly walked away from what was literally my last chance to find a costume I thought would help me fit in, all because of the overwhelming sensation of being hated that I felt inside that store. Even now, as an adult, I can vividly recall how intense that feeling was, and just writing about it makes me tense up. Despite everything, I did end up with a costume that year. We went home, and my mom stayed up late with me to piece together a cowboy costume from items we had at home. I had a cowboy hat from my grandpa, some cowboy boots from somewhere, a button-down shirt that we ripped to give it a rugged look, a bright red bandana to tie around my neck, and a leather vest that we made from a brown grocery bag. We even cut some super cool tassel fringe onto it.
Story 2. What knocked over the dresser?
I am not entirely sure how well this story fits, especially because my mom confirmed it years ago but later denied it when I asked her again recently. Still, it has always stayed with me, and here it is. When I was little, my dresser, a long but relatively short piece of furniture, was positioned against the wall with one of its ends pointed toward my bedroom door. This dresser was incredibly heavy, made of old wood, and had all sorts of my childhood belongings neatly arranged on top. Since it was in my bedroom, the floor was carpeted, and I always slept with my door closed at night. One night, something inexplicable happened. Without any warning or apparent reason, the dresser tipped over. But instead of simply falling forward, it somehow rotated 180 degrees to the side, landing directly in front of my door. Everything I had on top of it, books, toys, and even delicate glass figurines, spilled onto the carpeted floor. Strangely, none of it was broken. My mom, hearing the commotion, ran to get me. But when she tried to open the door, she found it blocked by the fallen dresser. Panicked, she called out to me, and together with her pushing and me pulling from the other side, we managed to create just enough space for her to slip into the room. She helped move the dresser out of the way. and everything was set upright the following day with my dad's help. Nothing seemed damaged, not even the fragile figurines I loved. We chalked it up as a strange accident and moved on. Years later, I remembered the incident vividly and brought it up with my mum. I was curious to hear her take on it, expecting her to explain that I had exaggerated the details or misunderstood what had happened. To my surprise, she confirmed the key point. She remembered the dresser falling, blocking the door, and the effort it took to get inside. However, she added one detail that I had never known before, and that detail has haunted me ever since. My mum mentioned that she thought she had heard me jumping on my bed that night before the dresser tipped over. That was why she believed the heavy piece of furniture had fallen in the first place. But here is the chilling part. I had been fast asleep the entire time. I have no idea where that noise could have come from, and neither does she. I tried asking her about it again a few months ago, but this time she denied remembering the incident altogether. I cannot help but wonder what really happened that night.
Story 3. Creepy words from my toddler.
I am a parent of toddlers and young kids, and something happened last year that I cannot stop thinking about. It was one of those moments that sends a chill down your spine. We were out driving one evening with my then 3-year-old son in the car. Everything was normal until we stopped at a red light next to a cemetery. The area was quiet, and the setting sun cast long shadows over the rows of headstones. It was the kind of scene that already felt a little eerie. Out of nowhere, my son, who had been quietly looking out the window, spoke up. He pointed toward the cemetery and said, "There are people laying down there, and they cannot get up." His words caught me off guard, but before I could respond, my wife asked him, "What are you talking about?" He turned to her, still pointing, and repeated, "All the people laying down in the park are stuck." My wife and I just stared at each other, completely stunned and unnerved. At that point in my son's life, there had been no deaths in our family. We had never discussed death, cemeteries, or anything remotely related to those topics. He had no context for what he was saying, at least none that we could explain. The rest of the drive was silent. My wife and I were too freaked out to speak, and my son seemed to return to his usual, cheerful self as if nothing had happened. But his words lingered in the air, heavy and chilling. To this day, I cannot explain how or why he said what he did. It still sends a shiver down my spine when I think about it, especially the innocence with which he made such a disturbing observation.
Story 4. The Shadow Man in the Blue House.
When I was a kid, my family lived in a blue house that had a very unusual shape. One year, a flood devastated the area and our house was almost entirely gutted and destroyed. After the repairs, a wall between the living room and kitchen was removed. This meant you could see straight down the hallway to my parents' bedroom door. Even back then, the house felt strange, for lack of a better term. I was a terrible sleeper as a child, and often found myself awake in the middle of the night. If I could not fall back asleep, I would tiptoe into the living room, turn on the television, and watch cartoons on the lowest volume setting. One early morning I was in the living room, lounging in a chair with my feet propped up against the window. Do not ask why I was an 8 or 9-year-old with strange habits. From my spot, I could see over the kitchen counter and straight down the hall to my parents' bedroom. That is when I noticed it, a movement near their door. I looked up, and saw the dark outline of a man walking slowly toward me. Assuming it was my dad, I called out, "Hey, Dad, sorry if the TV was too loud." My dad was a notoriously light sleeper and would wake up to even the faintest sound. But there was no response. Within seconds, my foot went straight through the window. I am still unsure if that was connected or if I was just clumsy, but it happened all the same. I screamed, and moments later, my parents came rushing out of their bedroom to see what had happened. It was 4:30 in the morning. My dad came bounding out of their room, which is when I realized it could not have been him I saw. For one, he was coming from the bedroom, not the hallway. Second, the shoulders of the shadowy figure I saw were much broader and higher than my dad's. Years later, we had long since moved out of the blue house. One day, my mom and I were chatting, and the topic of that house came up. I mentioned how it always gave me the creeps and how strange things would happen there. My mom's response, "Oh, you must have seen the shadow man too." To this day, her casual confirmation chills me to my core.
Story 5. The Missing Stairs.
When I was younger, my grandmother was a real estate agent in Rhode Island, and one summer I stayed with her for a while. One day she had to take me along to check out a potential listing. The house we visited was unlike any I had seen before. It was circular, with all the rooms arranged along the outside, each one connecting to the next. In the center of the house, there was a small garden that was open to the sky, an odd but peaceful sight. My grandmother had to go upstairs, so I decided to stay downstairs and walk around the loop of the house by myself. I thought it would be simple enough, just a quick stroll to pass the time. But as I walked the full loop of the rooms, something strange happened. I realized that I couldn't find the stairs. At first I thought I must have missed them, so I kept walking, thinking they would appear in the next room. But each room I entered only led to more confusion. There were no stairs in sight. A sinking feeling started to creep in. I walked faster now, running from room to room, checking each one again and again, but there was no way up. Panic slowly settled in as the silence in the house grew thicker and heavier. I started to feel trapped. The house, which I had once thought was peaceful, now felt like a maze with no escape. My breathing quickened, and I ran through the rooms with a sense of dread gnawing at me. After what felt like forever, I finally collapsed by the front door, tears streaming down my face. It was quiet, too quiet. I felt completely alone. Not long after, I heard my grandmother's frantic footsteps approaching. She burst into the entryway room, her face pale and panicked. "Where were you hiding?" she asked. "Why weren't you answering me? I've been calling for you." I was stunned. I hadn't heard her calling for me at all. In fact, the house had been so still, so unnervingly quiet while I sat there. I was sure she had forgotten me and left. We went home that day without really talking about it, but the experience stayed with me. It didn't make sense. The house wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't complicated to navigate. So why couldn't I find the stairs? Why hadn't I heard her calling? It didn't add up. Fast forward 15 years later, and I decided to bring it up to my mom. I asked her if she knew anything about it, or if I had just imagined the whole thing. My mom's response shocked me. She clearly remembered the incident because my grandmother had called her, frantic and shaken, unable to explain what had happened. She was convinced that she had lost me or that something had taken me while she was distracted. My grandmother had been searching the house for what seemed like an eternity, yet I had never heard her. To this day, I still don't understand what happened. The house wasn't confusing, and I hadn't wandered off. But every time I think back to that moment, a cold shiver runs down my spine. Something was wrong in that house, and I'll never be able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was watching me.
Story 6. Trapped in the Autumn Night.
When I was very young, my family went on a trip to the backwoods of New Hampshire and Maine in the autumn to watch the leaves change. We were staying at a cottage, and this area was somewhere we visited frequently. One night, as we were driving back from somewhere, my mother suddenly screamed at my father to stop the car. In front of us, on a desolate, unkempt back road deep in the New England woods, there was a traffic jam. A line of cars, seemingly blocking all directions, sat eerily still in the dim light of the evening. The headlights from the stopped vehicles cast an unsettling glow across the scene, and I remember seeing my dad's face as he turned the car around, trying to get a sense of where he was going. What stuck with me, though, was the complete silence from my mother. She had been shouting only moments before, but now she was deathly quiet, almost frozen in place. My dad, despite the tension, said with a calmness that sent a chill through me, I hate traffic." He quickly turned the car around, driving back up the road we had just come down. But it wasn't long before we started to see headlights flashing from the other cars around us. People drove by honking their horns and flashed their lights aggressively. The air, once filled with the excitement of a family trip, now felt heavy and suffocating. It was as if the atmosphere had changed completely, and even I, a child, could sense it. From a place of joy, the mood shifted to something darker. The other cars seemed to be following us, closing in, honking relentlessly. At some point they turned off the road, and we drove back to the cottage in silence. It wasn't until years later, sitting down with my dad over a beer, that the truth of that night came to light. He casually brought it up, asking if I remembered that strange traffic jam in the woods. I thought about it for a second and said, "Yeah, but I just thought it was traffic or people acting weird." My dad's expression grew serious as he continued, "Well, your mum and I were pretty sure that it was one of those ambushes where they block the road to rob you, or worse." My heart sank as I listened. He said, "You don't remember the cars coming up behind us, trying to block us in, or the ones chasing us, honking and flashing their lights until we turned off onto some random road?" I didn't remember much more than the headlights, but the way he spoke made me realize how close we had been to something far more sinister. He stopped talking about it after that, and we quickly moved on to something mundane, like how we should plant trees in the backyard ones that wouldn't drop leaves, because leaves are a hassle. But that night in the woods, the way my dad spoke about it still haunts me.
Story 7. The Shared Dream.
One night when I was 12, I woke up suddenly from a dream that my older brother had gotten into a car accident. I felt an unsettling sense of urgency, so I got out of bed and wandered downstairs to get something to drink. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, and she asked me why I was awake. I told her I had a bad dream and needed something to drink. As I was getting a glass of water, the doorbell rang. My mother went to see who it was in the middle of the night. I could hear muffled voices, but I didn't understand what they were saying because I was still in the kitchen and they were in the hallway. After a few moments, my mother came back into the kitchen, completely pale. She told me I needed to go back to bed now. Confused, I asked her what was wrong, and she informed me that my brother had been in a car accident and that she needed to wake up my dad to go to the hospital right away. When I pointed out that this was the exact bad dream I had just woken up from, she looked at me for a few seconds, and then, to my surprise, she said, "Me too." So both of us had the same dream about my brother having a car accident, and we both woke up just minutes before the police arrived to confirm it. My brother survived with minor injuries, and the next day we saw the photos of the accident in the newspaper. It was eerie because the details in the photo were almost identical to what we had dreamed. Everything from the way he lost control of the car to the tree it crashed into. To this day, my mother and I talk about it, but no one else believes us when we tell the story. It still feels like something that can't be fully explained.
Story 8. Whispers in the Dark.
At my parents' house, I used to hear my mom calling out to me when she wasn't, and she confirmed that she'd hear me call out to her when I didn't. That was a common occurrence. Also, whenever I'd be alone for a little while, if my mom was late from work or at the grocery store, I'd usually be in the main living room playing my Nintendo 64. I would often hear loud, banging sounds from upstairs, as if a heavy piece of furniture had tipped over. I'd go check, and nothing was out of place. Both my mother and grandmother have confirmed similar experiences when they're alone in the house. There was also the time I was downstairs on my laptop. Everyone else was in bed, and it was after midnight. I didn't realize just how dark everything had gotten without the lights on. I was zoned out when I began to hear what sounded like murmuring from behind me, like the low rumble you'd hear at a gathering when people are talking, but you can't make out the conversation. The hairs on my neck immediately stood up, and my body locked up from fear. Tears ran down my face from the physical reaction my body was having. I refused to acknowledge it and kept staring at my laptop screen in silence. It took forever for my body to go back to normal. Sometime later, I told my mother what had happened, and it freaked her out because she said she had heard the murmuring as well. I've always hated that house.
Story 9. The Haunted Portrait.
When my great-aunt passed away, my dad inherited a bunch of antiques and family heirlooms. Along with it came several creepy portraits, one of which I swore was haunted. I called her Aunt Jane, and she was a nice ghost. I was about 12 years old at the time, which, looking back, might be a little old for imaginary ghosts. But no one really knew how to handle the situation, least of all me. When Aunt Jane arrived, she asked if I could find a photo of her when she was younger and display it somewhere, as she thought she looked too old in the large portrait. My dad probably thought I was being silly, but he humored me. We briefly searched for the photo she wanted, but it was nowhere to be found. Instead, I settled on another portrait of her. It wasn't the right one, but I wasn't allowed to mess with the antiques without permission. So I gave up the search and the portraits were stored away in the attic. 20 years later, I visited my parents' house and felt compelled to go up into the attic. I found the boxes of heirlooms, and something in my brain told me, you need to take these home with you today. I lived in an apartment with little space, but something just wouldn't let me ignore the feeling. I asked my dad if I could take the photographs and digitize them, and he agreed. Not long after, a tornado hit my parents' house and tore off the roof, leaving the attic exposed to the elements. I thought to myself, wow, I'm really glad I took those photos. But I just chalked it up to luck or intuition. Maybe halfway through scanning the photos, I found it, there she was. I can't even begin to describe the overwhelming rush of emotions I felt when I saw her face. This was the photo Aunt Jane's ghost had asked for. I thought, surely I must be crazy. It's probably just a lady from the same time period, so their hairstyles match. And then I turned it over to read the name on the back. Later that day, I called my dad and asked if he remembered Aunt Jane's ghost. He said that he did, and that the portrait was still right where we'd left it. I had him send me a photo, and though the back of his is not labeled because it's a giant pin back button, we both think it's the same person. What do you think?
Story 10. The Abandoned House.
When I was 10 years old, I often visited a friend who lived about 4 miles away from me. The journey to his house was always a bit unsettling. I had to walk next to a vast cornfield with only a handful of abandoned-looking houses scattered on the side of the road. The cornfield seemed endless, its tall stalks blocking any view of what might be hidden within. The houses along the road were eerily quiet, their windows boarded up, and the doors always shut tight. It was as though people had simply vanished, leaving everything behind in a hurry. No one had moved into those houses for as long as I could remember. After spending time at my friend's house, I had to walk back home by myself. The street was always empty, with no one around. It felt like I was walking through a forgotten part of the world. There was rarely anyone out walking their dogs or jogging. I was alone, just a small child, lost in a world of silence. One evening, as I walked home, my shoelace came undone. I bent over to tie it, my thoughts wandering. Suddenly, I felt a strange presence. A shadow stretched over me, and I froze. I quickly looked behind me, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw her. An old woman with short black hair was standing only a few inches behind me. Her face was twisted in the most terrifying smile I had ever seen, her eyes hollow and dark. She was reaching for my shoulder, her bony fingers inching closer with every passing second. Her smile never wavered, and the coldness of her gaze sent a shiver through my entire body. I couldn't move. Fear gripped me, freezing me in place for what felt like an eternity. But then my instincts kicked in. I snapped out of my terror and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't dare look back, but I could still feel her eyes on me, burning into my back. I ran all the way to my house, tears streaming down my face as I gasped for breath. When I burst through the door, I was shaking uncontrollably. My parents were alarmed, and I told them everything. They were calm at first, but when I mentioned the houses, my mom said, "There's nobody living there. Those houses have been abandoned for years." That night, I tried to push the memory from my mind, but I couldn't forget the old woman. Over the next 11 years, I passed those same houses countless times, but never once did I see anyone near them. The windows remained boarded up, and the doors stayed shut, as if frozen in time. Not a soul had moved in, and no one had ever seen the woman I encountered. Every time I pass that road now, a chill runs down my spine. Even as an adult, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from those houses. The memory of her smile haunts me, and I get shivers just thinking about that moment. I still don't know who she was or why she was there, but I'll never forget that terrifying encounter. That road, those houses, and the old woman with the evil smile are forever burned into my memory.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.